And now you can send the people ready to roll.
Okay.
Yeah, Lamed test. 39A. See, it says YouTube. Does it say, it needs to say Zoom also? It doesn't need to say Zoom. Fine. Even though it doesn't say Zoom, but you're saying it is Zoom, what?
Yeah.
Okay, very. You want to tell everyone that ready to roll? Very good. Okay, good morning, everybody. We are on Lamed test of an Aleph, 39A. Okay, we're going to get now, morning, Ariel. We're going to get into, when you say a bracha, something you say a bracha on a whole item, on a piece of an item, preference and brachos. We're gonna get into that now. Before we do that, we have a small piece of Gemara over here. Amar Rav Chia bar Abba. We're now 4 lines from the bottom. You have it, Morris? 4 lines from the bottom. Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi. Pas senuma. So what's pas senuma? So pas senuma is you have bread that's very dried out bread, and what you did was you soaked it. Rashi says, and you put it into a bowl. You put water on in the bowl, and you soak this bread. And as a result of the soaking of bread, the bread, as a result of that, became very watery, Moni Akiva, and the bread dissolved a certain amount. And now the question is, we're just admitting a couple of guys into the group. Morning. Okay. Okay, who Mike, you're on? Morning. So now so that's what you did. You went ahead and before
Good morning, Rabbi.
Morning, Mike. Who else came on? Someone else also came on. So what you do, you soak this bread in the water. And now after you soak the bread in the water, now you're gonna eat it. Now you're gonna make hamotzi on that bread. But as a result of soaking it in water, it became it's not whole anymore. The bread is not whole anymore. Okay, when you had a whole piece of bread, now you soaked it. It became small pieces of bread, right? Because it's a very dry bread. Dry, it became very hard, and therefore, as a result of that, let's say you had an old piece of bread. Now you want to make that old piece of bread edible. So what you do, you take some water, you soak the bread in the water, but now as a result of that, the bread becomes soft. Right. I mean, olive oil we had before, but olive oil would be if you would put it in there, be used most probably also to be the same thing. But here the question the Gemara is it appropriate to soak it before you say the bracha? You have to be careful when you say the bracha that the bread at the time that you say the bracha, the bread should be whole, or even if it's in pieces, the bread's in pieces, it's not an issue. You have to be concerned that the bread should be whole when you say the blessing, or that's not something you have to be concerned about, and therefore there's no problem for you to soak it
regular day of the week.
Regular day of the week. So here comes the Gemara. Pas senuma. So this dry bread, you say hamotzi. Of course you say hamotzi. What do you mean? Of course, if you take a piece of bread and it's still bread. What's the chidush? The chidush is that even though you make it, you don't have to make sure to go ahead and say the bracha while it's whole before you soak it. You don't have to be concerned about that. That's not something you have to be particular about. You could cut it into pieces before you say the bracha. And the Gemara says, "Upliga Rav Chia." This argues Rav Chia. Rav Chia went on record. He says the Amar Rav Chia, Sarach shetichle. Sarach shetichle. The bracha has to, when you say the hamotzi lechem in the aretz, the bracha concludes with the cutting of the bread. Now that's not the halacha how we do it. How do we do it? Let's say, as Mr. Haber said, on an ordinary day, today, if you're having a roll, right? You're having a bagel. So you would say the bracha on the bagel whole, and then after you finish the bracha, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam motzi lechem min haaretz, then you cut the bagel, right? You don't go ahead and cut the bagel while you're saying the bracha. Now, this opinion is very concerned for delay of time between the blessing and the eating. So therefore, this opinion says that, you know what you're supposed to do? Mike, you hear us? This opinion says what you're supposed to do.
Yes, Rabbi.
Yes, this opinion says you're supposed to go ahead and towards right when you're closing in on the end of the bracha motzi lechem min haaretz. At that point, you should start cutting the bread, and then by the time you finish the bracha min haaretz, the bread will be completely cut simultaneously with the motzi lechem min haaretz, and then you'll eat it right away. That is what this opinion says. Now, halachically, we're going to see we don't do that. What we do is, it's brought down, is that many people do is they make a little nick in the bread before you say the bracha at all. You make a little cut in the bread. You don't cut it too much, but you cut it enough that it's easy for you after the bracha. You put the knife. The fact that you already started it a little bit will make it easy for you to cut the bread as a result of that, and therefore there won't be a long delay between the bracha and the eating. But you did not cut the whole thing up while you're saying the bracha. Only the cutting really happens. 99% of the cutting happens after the bracha is fully complete.
We don't do that. We don't cut.
You don't cut even. You don't even make a nick. You're saying.
Ashkenaz do.
Ashkenaz do, right? But Svada maybe don't do that. And Shabbat on Shabbos, Tosfos points out, Shabbos we're more concerned that we wouldn't make that. Some don't make that, and even the people who make that nick during the week, because Shabbos we have the law of Lechem Mishnah and two breads, and we're more concerned about that you shouldn't come to cut it too much, and that it's not going to be whole breads anymore. So therefore, on Shabbos, many people will stay away from doing that at all. But during the weekdays, many people in the Ashkenaz community will cut a little bit in order to make it easier for you after you say the bracha, that it should be easy for you to cut it. Okay? That's the issue over here in the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Upligi de Rav Chia, the Omer Rav Chia, because Rav Chia says, Sarosh Tichla Bracha Mapah. Rav Chia says, Good morning, Yaron.
Rabbi, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Good to see you. Now, Maskefla Rava. So Rava has the following question on Rav Chia. Maishnat Suma. Rav Chia, what's the issue that, according to Rav Chia, there's an issue with the Snuma? According to the Rav Chia says that this dried bread, you should not go ahead and soak it first. You should go ahead and what does he say he's supposed to do about dry bread? You should say a bracha on the dry bread first. Why? Maishna, Mishmoni Shmuel Reiv. Mishum the lo kalia bracha Maishna tsuma. What is the issue with the tsuma, the dried bread that's soaked in water? Mishum de kalia bracha aprusa kalia. The concern is that if you're going to go ahead and you're going to soak it first, you're going to soak this dry bread first, what will happen is, by the time you say the bracha hamotzi, the motzi will be on a piece that's already into small little pieces. And you don't want to do that. You want the pieces that it should be cut into pieces at the end of the bracha. But you don't want it to be that you open up the bracha you say bracha on bread that's already cut. We rather that the bread should not be cut. We want the cutting of the bread to happen at the end of the bracha, according to that opinion. So the Gemara says, but if you allow the cutting of the bread, of the normal piece of bread, you allow to cut it during the bracha, right? You're saying that at the end of the bracha, you say hamotzi lechem, and you're cutting the bread at the end of the bracha. So according to you, by the end of the bracha, the bread is not whole. So he says the main thing about the bread, this opinion holds, is it's the end of the bracha. If you hold that the end of the bracha does not need to be whole, so then in the beginning of the bracha also doesn't have to. So therefore, the challenge that the Gemara says to this rabbi is, what's the concern that you have about the dried bread? You want to say there's an issue about the dried bread because if you dry the bread first, if you soak the dried bread first, therefore the bread will be in pieces by the time you want to say the hamotzi. But according to your opinion, the bread is also in pieces because you say that you cut the bread during the bracha. But by the time you finish, meaning in both cases, on a normal bread, according to Rav Chia, when do you say the hamotzi lechem in aretz? While you're cutting the bread. A normal piece of bread, he says, again, we said that's not the halakha. You always say the bracha first, and then you cut the bread. But Rav Chia says no. By the time you end the bracha, the piece should already be cut. If that's the case, if the piece should already be cut, so if it's allowed to be cut at the end of the bracha, so you should be able to cut it. It should be able to be cut beforehand also, and therefore you shouldn't be so concerned about soaking the bread before the bracha. If you hold that you actually have a right to cut the bread before the end of the bracha, so you should therefore we should be allowed to soak it as well beforehand. Because at the end of the day, if you soak it before the bracha, by the time you say the end of the bracha, it will be in pieces. And if you don't soak it before the bracha, you say that you actually could cut it before the end of the bracha. So if you're allowed to cut it before the end of the bracha, you should be able to soak it as well beforehand. That's what the Gemara is saying. And therefore, the Gemara is saying, I don't agree with you. He says, therefore, he says, Rava says, Ella, the Gemara says, Maskefla Rava, look at the bottom of the page, 2 lines at the bottom. Maishnat snuma, the low. What's the issue of snuma mishum the kakalia bracha, akrusa kakalia? The conclusion of the bracha is on a piece because you soaked it beforehand. So if you're going to cut it during the bracha, the bracha is going to be concluded on a broken piece, and therefore, there's no great gain by having the bread whole and complete if you're going to cut it during the bracha. So Rava is really saying, don't tell me there's something unique about starting the bracha with the bread whole and then cutting it in the middle. If you're going to cut it in the middle, what's the main part? One of the main parts of the bracha is the conclusion of a bracha, right? If you recite a bracha, let's say a person went ahead and you had in mind to say a Borei Priya 8 on something, and then you caught yourself at the end of the bracha, and let's say you want to make a Borei Priya 8 on the coffee. Then you said, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, and then at the end you said, no, you caught yourself, you said, Sha'akol niyeh b'dvaro. It's good. You concluded the bracha correctly. You get credit for the bracha. The end of the bracha is very key. So if you're saying that the end of the bracha, you have no problem that it could be cut during the end of the bracha, so too the beginning of the bracha should not make such a big difference. And therefore, Rava says, no. Rava says, not only the end of the bracha, the food should be whole, not only the beginning of the bracha, also at the end. So Rav is the one who teaches us that you should not cut the bread during the bracha. You should wait till after the bracha. That's what the Gemara says. Ella, now we turn the page. Ella Amarava. We welcome Shmuel and Avram and Shmuel. Ella Amarava. We're on Lamed Testament base. Ella Amarava. Mevorech v'achake. What did you say, Mr. Amos? If you have a small piece,
because they say
any amount of bread, you have to say what? Right.
So you just
right. But the question is, if you have the opportunity to say a bracha on a whole bread, then now how do you do it? I have a whole bread. Amos says, if you have a piece of bread, you make a bracha on a piece of bread. But if I have opportunity in front of me, I have a whole bread, I have a whole challah, I should say matzah. Sfardim don't say motzi matzah.
They don't have to go.
That's true. But if you have the opportunity to say a bracha on a whole thing, you leave it whole until after the bracha. That's what the Gemara is telling us. El amarava mivarech va'achakach botzeya. You should go ahead and say a bracha and then cut the food, because we want that the bracha, the blessing, should be on a whole thing, on a whole item. Now the Gemara says not.
That because you want respect.
Right, it's respect that you say a bracha on a whole thing. Correct. But in the city of Nahardai, the Bnei Yeshiva in Nahardai, it's in Bavel, Avdik Rav Chia. They followed Rav Chia. They said we have to cut the bread at the end of the bracha, in the middle of saying the bracha, and at the end of the bracha, they would cut the bread, because they were very concerned with delay between the blessing and the eating. And therefore they said, we got to do the cutting. Now, so one of the commentaries pointed out, even though when you're involved in saying a bracha, you're not supposed to be involved doing some other things, multitasking when you're saying a bracha, right? When you're saying a bracha, you're not supposed to be talking on, texting on a phone when you're saying a bracha, right? You can't be, you're not supposed to be doing multitasking. So yet we're allowing you to cut while you're saying the bracha. So one of the commentators explained, because the cutting is for the purpose of the food. It's not like you're doing something a different item. You're not like you're not like reading the newspaper while you're saying a bracha. You're saying the bracha because he's of the opinion that you need to go ahead and create not a very small amount of time between the blessing and the eating, and therefore he said you could cut it. That's for the purpose of that item. So he holds that's not called an interruption. So that's his opinion. Now Nahardai in Nahardai Avdi Rav Chia. Nahardai, they did like Rav Chia. By the way, we could just also by the way, a lot of times when you learn a Gemara, even if the halacha doesn't follow that opinion, but we could take out a law from a sensitivity from that opinion, the importance of not having delay. Because the reason why the Rabbi Shia said you should go ahead and cut at the end of the bracha, that you should conclude the cutting by the time you finish the bracha, is in order that we shouldn't have a delay between the blessing and the eating. And therefore, by cutting it during the bracha, you will save a second or two between the blessing and the eating. So it just shows you the sensitivity, how sensitive he was, that there shouldn't be a delay. So even though we hold that you can go ahead and say the bracha and don't have to cut it first, you don't have to cut it during the bracha, you could say it on the whole item, and you're only going to cut it after you completed the bracha. But yet we need to be sensitive to be on the move and to be swift. Once we finish the bracha, we cut it immediately, and we should go ahead and eat it. Now, the Gemara says that Rabbanan Avdi Kirava, but the Chachamim, the rabbis, their custom was like Rava, that these were the rabbis in the place of Ravina and Rav Ashi. They held like Rava, that you first recite the blessing, and then you go ahead and you do the cutting. Now the Gemara says, Omar Ravina. Ravina says, Omrli aim. My mother told me. And Ravina's father was Rav Huna. And he wasn't the famous Rav Huna. He was a different Rav Huna. And Ravina said, and what happened to Ravina, lost his father when Ravina was very young. And his mother would tell him over the traditions of the home, the customs of the home, that his father, certain customs his father had. And so that's what the Gemara says. So now, his mother told him, Amar Ravina, really aim. My mom told me, Avucha Avid Rav Chia, your father, his custom was like Rav Chia, that he actually cut the bread towards the end of the reciting of the bracha. He would cut the bread, and that when that simultaneously, when he concluded Lechem in Haaretz, the bread was completely cut at that moment. But we don't do that mistake. We said that we do is after we finish the bracha, then we cut the bread. But the way they did it was they actually cut the bread towards the end of the reciting of the bracha, towards the end, but not at the end, not after the reciting of the bracha, but right when they were middle saying Hamotzi Lechem, they were already cutting the bread, and then it came simultaneously. The moment they finished the bracha Motzi Lechem min haaretz, at the same time, at that moment, the bread was already cut. The cutting was completed. The piece was already separated, and that's not what we do. Is that clear to everybody on the screen? What we're saying over here, and that was it. And Ravina says that his mother told him that his father conducted himself like a Chia. The Omer of Chia, Sorech Shetichla Bracha. The conclusion of the bracha should come simultaneously with the Im Hapas, with the cutting of the bread, and the piece should be cut during that time period that you're finishing the bracha. And Rabbanan Avdi Kerava, and the Rabbanan hold like Rava, that says that the cutting of the bread should only be done after the conclusion of the bracha. After you finish the bracha, then you cut it. And the Gemara says V'hilchasa Kerava. The halacha is like Rava, the Oma Mivarech V'achakach Botzeah. The halacha is like Rava, that you say the bracha, and then you go ahead and then you cut the bread. First you finish the bracha. So if we look in the Shulchan Aruch, Aleph, the Kuf Pei Zayin, get out the Mishnah Berurah. So it says in the Shulchan Aruch the following. It says, where is it? Kuf Samach Zayin. Sima Kuf Samach Zayin. He does say the way the Shulchan Aruch says. He says, no, he does say this little thing about the nick also. Maybe it might not be he does say that you make this little nick in the bread. That in order that the bread should be, you shouldn't have a long period of time between the bracha and the cutting. And then he says, now the point is, what's called, how much could you cut? Technically, if you cut an amount, if you cut enough, that if you will pick up the piece that you cut, let's say you have a piece of bread, right? Let's say you go ahead and the bread is cut. There's a crack in the bread. See, let's say by matzah on Pesach, you want to know if the matzah is a whole matzah. You're making out a shalem, right? You need lechem mishnah. At what point do we say that the matzah is not whole? Everybody hears the question. There's two things. There's something called, sometimes you're missing a piece. If you're missing some bread, is it still considered whole? If you have a roll, you have a bagel, you have a matzah. If there's a piece of matzah missing, is that matzah still called whole or not? So there's opinions that say that as long as not more than 1/48 of the item is missing, it's still considered whole. Right. So you got that? If let's say you have a matzah and it's less than 1/48 is missing of the matzah, or even up to 1/48 of the matzah is missing, you're good. It's still considered whole. If that's a major opinion. That's one opinion. I mean, some people might be stricter and say if anything is missing, it's a problem. But there's definitely this opinion, this major opinion that's brought down. Let's say it cracked off a piece. Piece was cracked off. That's the case when the matzah, something is missing. At what point is something called missing that it's called that it's not whole anymore? So if something that's one that's one case that's called not whole. The other question is if something is cracked. Nothing is missing, but it's cracked. The matzah is cracked, full. But is that called whole or not because of the crack? You hear the question? So how does that work? What?
You have the other part.
You have the whole matzah. Everyone listening, you have a whole matzah, but there's a nice crack in 1/4 of the matzah. There's a crack that goes 25% into the matzah, the crack. So now, is this matzah considered whole or not whole? So the way to tell if it's considered whole or not, if you would take that smaller spot, let's say there's a crack that goes, and if you would hold it, would the piece fall off or not fall off? If you would hold that matzah in the smallest, in the side that has that crack, and you're able to lift up the matzah, then it's not considered crack. It's not considered crack.
Same thing with bread.
Same thing with bread. That's the rule. If you want to know the rule, if something is considered whole or not whole on Shabbat, the challah has something.
Hold it up and it
Doesn't fall off. That means it's still whole. That if you hold up that small spot. What do you say? Make mezonah on matzah all year round except Pesach. Right. That's the difference between Sfardim and Ashkenazim all year round. As the Amos said, all year round. We have some Ashkenazim on the screen too. We all year round. Sfardim say mezonot on matzah. Ashkenazim say hamotzi on matzah all year round. Okay. Now, so that's and he says. He says, after you conclude the bracha, then you go ahead and you cut it. You make sure that the bracha is concluded while the bread is whole. So that's clearly that's what Mr. Amos said before. You will still say hamotzi on it. You're stuck. I mean, a guy got you buy something that's already cut up. It's cut up. What are you supposed to do? It's cut up. Now, on what?
No, not here. Not here. Not here. But the Rabbi Fari told him someone because
Now, what's the issue on Shabbat? He says.
Not everybody does it.
He says with Shabbat. Meaning, let's listen to this.
Here, some of them.
You see, on Shabbat, we're extra concerned. What are we concerned about on Shabbat? Shabbat, we need lechem mishnah, right? There's a special law of having 2 whole breads on Shabbat, right? And we're afraid that if you're going to cut on Shabbat the same way you do during the weekdays, maybe you're going to go too far. And if you go too far, you're actually going to cut too far that it's not going to be any whole bread. So on Shabbat, meaning we make a distinction between Shabbat and the weekdays. And on weekdays, we're not as concerned. Make that cut, make that nick before you say the bracha. Don't cut it too much because you want to keep it whole still. But at the end of the day, if at the end of the day you cut it too far, too much, it's a weekday. You lost out on doing the mitzvah of saying the bracha on a whole challah during the weekday, which is a more respectable way to say the bracha. But as we could say, the world is not coming to an end, if that's the proper expression to use. If you went too far, if you started on a weekday and you were trying to create that before you started the bracha, you made a nick into the challah, you cut the challah a little bit in order for the purpose of getting it ready, that after the bracha it should be easy to cut the remainder amount. So even if you're careful not to cut too much because you don't want to separate it, but if you went ahead and you went too far during the weekdays, it's not as big a concern as Shabbat. If you cut it and you went too far, Therefore, we say on Shabbat, don't touch it on Shabbat. That's according to this. No, during the week, you're not right to chalas, but we're saying, but there's a law of having something whole. There's on Shabbat, there's supposed to be two whole breads. Lechem Mishnah. The bread is supposed to be two breads that are whole. No, but during the weekdays, there's also a concept. If you have in front of you, you have a bagel that's whole, you have a roll that's whole, and you have in front of you a piece of, and you plan on cutting up that roll. Let's give a simple case. You have a roll, a roll that you say hamotzi on, okay? Something you say hamotzi and it's whole. You're supposed to keep it whole until after the bracha. And therefore, that's why we don't cut it too much before the bracha. We can make a nick because you should cut it. At least this is what the Shulchan Aruch is suggesting that we're supposed to be doing. Now, I don't think, I could be that many people don't do it at all, because since on Shabbat we don't make this nick, so it could be that's why the people, during the weekdays, people don't commonly eat bread so much, maybe they're not so sensitive to it. Yes.
Sometimes say couple. But
I mean, there might be. I think there's different customs about that. Exactly. Meaning after Netilat Yadayim, I wonder if people. I'm not sure if people. I'm not sure about that custom. There might be people. We might be different customs on that. Ashkenazim, many of them don't. Now, right. I want to get at the Yalkut Yosef. In the Yalkut Yosef, in Kuf Samach Zayin, regarding these halachot. By the way, the fact that we're learning about all this is going to make everybody think twice before they say before they eat bread. It's going to put them into the right mindset of kavanah. You know, I always say, the halacha says that when you say a bracha, you hold the bread in. Let's say if I go bread, we hold with two hands, right? You're supposed to put 10. You're supposed to get 10 fingers on the bread. You say a bracha on bread, you get 10 fingers on the bread, because there are 10 mitzvot connected with bread. The different reasons why we put 10 fingers on the bread. But let's say you have a drink, coffee, right? So it says you hold it in your right hand. You say a bracha. The fact that you have to hold it in your right hand, any food that you're saying a bracha on, a righty has to hold it in the right hand. A lefty, Ashkenazim might say do it left hand. Sfardim might still say everything. They might say everything in the right hand. You say the bracha. I think that's what the Sfardim hold. But the fact that you have to hold it in a certain hand, your hand, that means you can't just say the bracha. For sure, according to everybody, all opinions, if you're a righty, everybody agrees when you say the bracha, you're not supposed to be holding the cup in your left hand. You're saying the bracha. You're supposed to be holding in the right hand. So I always say the fact that you need to hold it in your right hand. When Sammy says we need Madison Square Garden, the fact that you have to hold it in your right hand makes you think. The fact that you're thinking about it's going to make you say a better bracha. That's what I believe. And that's now in you see, it does say in the Yalkut Yosef, he does say that we should go ahead. He says you should cut a little bit of the bread. Okay, we're talking about, let's say for the weekdays, we'll have to see what he holds by Shabbat. He says you should cut a little of the bread and then start to make the bracha, and then separate, then finish the cutting. But on Shabbat and Yom Tov, don't touch it at all. Don't cut at all the challah before you say the bracha. Don't even make the nick. But if you forgot on Shabbat, a guy forgot and he out of habit, because during the week he always makes a little cut in the challah before he says the bracha, and he goes ahead and he forgot and he made that little nick. And I want to know, Rabbi, is it still considered lechem mishnah? Do I got to take out another challah? So as long with the rules that we said before, as long as you're able to pick up the challah, he didn't make it cut. No one's a little nick is not going to cut the challah enough that if you pick up the small part that the challah is going to fall apart. Therefore, it's still considered whole the challah. He didn't lose anything lechem mishnah, and therefore you're good. And he's how do you like that, Mr. Haber? And then he says, and if a guy doesn't have lechem mishnah on Shabbat, so you make a bracha on what you got. If you're not able to get it, you make a bracha on what you got. So that's the halacha. Again, is that clear to everybody? So what comes out from here It comes out halacha that many people are not careful about. And based on what we learned today, what comes out is that everybody who's having, especially anything that's hard, and hard, like a nice hard water challah during the weekdays. Water challah during the weekdays. On Shabbat, we're saying don't touch it before the bracha. Don't make a nick before the bracha. But if it's during the weekdays, you're having a hard roll or hard something, what comes out the halacha seems to be saying in Shulchan Aruch, Yalkut Yosef, everybody seems to be saying, in order that there shouldn't be a large delay between the bracha and the eating, make a nick in the bread. Make a nick in the bread before you say the bracha. Make a little nick every day, Sammy, and then you say that the nick makes a certain size, not too much of a big cut, and then you say the bracha. After you say the bracha, then you go back to that spot that you made that nick, and you can continue cutting, and therefore that will save some time. That seems to be the halacha that you should do during the weekdays. And he clearly says during the weekdays, if you have a whole bread, a whole roll, a whole something, mitzvah and a mufat to say a bracha on the whole thing than on saying that the piece. It would come out according to this. Let's say it would sound like to me, you have a table, they serve on the table, there's bread, there's rolls on the table, and you're gonna make sandwiches, deli sandwiches. And they give you on the table, they have these club rolls, and then you're gonna take these club rolls, you're gonna slice it open and make the sandwich. It would seem like, go ahead, don't make the sandwich yet. Don't cut it open, make the sandwich, and say the bracha on that. Better to say the bracha on while the roll is whole, while the club roll is whole. Say the bracha on that, and then after you say the bracha on the whole thing, and you ate a little bit, then cut it up, and then that would be the more ideal way to go. I don't know if people are sensitive to it, but we're bringing out this point because there's an idea to say a bracha on something whole. Okay. So now the Gemara continues. Itmar. Now the following was said in the Beit Midrash. Heviu lifneihem petitim ushleimim. So here we have a case. They brought in front of you, they had breads that were whole and breads that were cut. So what is the halacha? Which one should you say a bracha on? So everything what we said until now is if you have in front of you a choice and you have multiple breads, a whole bread and a cut up bread, a whole roll and a slice of a roll, take the whole roll, say the bracha on the whole roll, right, Akiva, Claire? So itma, if you see the Shem, Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna says that he does not look at something whole. This is the way Rashi understands. He does not look, if you have something that's whole, and you have something else that's equal in size, that's not whole, he says they both have the same law. His opinion is he doesn't look at the whole.
He looks at the size.
He looks at the size. And if the size is the same as the whole, you're good. You're good. You could do it on any one you want. According to Rav Huna. He says, you have a right to make a bracha on the piece that's and and that piece, and as a result of you saying the bracha on the piece of the bread, then afterwards you could eat the whole bread, and the bracha on the piece of bread will cover you for that whole roll. You had a whole roll, and you had a half of a roll. The whole roll was a small whole roll, and a piece of bread was from a big roll, and they're equal in size. You could do whatever you want. That's the opinion of Rav Huna. However, Rabbi Yochanan holds v'amar shleima mitzvah min hamufcha. He says that shleima, having it whole, that's the best way to. That's the best. That's better. That's more ideal. So even though the other thing whole and if the other thing is similar in size, so then you go after the whole. That's what he says. And now the Gemara continues. The Gemara says, "Aval prusa shalchitim." If you have a piece from wheat, if let's say you have a piece of bread that's from wheat, and we know wheat is better than barley. Even the Torah, in the order of the Shivat HaMinim of the Torah, it says Eretz Chita Usora. What is listed first of the seven is wheat. Number two on the all-time list, barley. So therefore, barley, and we all know barley is second to wheat. We know, as the Sefer Chinuch says, barley is more of, a lot of times they feed that to animals, and wheat is more of a human. It's mostly but eaten by human beings. So if we have now we have a question: if you have barley, and the barley bread is whole, and the wheat bread is cut. So now who's the winner? So the winner is the wheat bread is the winner. The wheat bread is the winner. Let's see the language of the Gemara. Of a prusa shalchitin, a piece of wheat bread, shlema min asorim, and if you have the whole bread is from barley, so divrei hakol mevarech ala prusa shalchitim. You go after the piece of the wheat. The wheat is better than the whole barley, because it's much more significant. It's much greater quality. So therefore quality is stronger than wholeness of an item. The fact that something is whole, the fact that something is, and you can understand that. Taste is most probably the most important thing of you make a bracha. You want it. That's one of the reasons why when you make a bracha on bread, they would have salt on the table and dip the bread into salt. What was one of the reasons behind that? Because the salt gives taste to the bread. What? One reason, like Ariel said, is because the Beit HaMikdash, the Torah says, "Al kol karbon chatakev melach." And every karban, and every you're saying, every offering, the Torah says it's supposed to be salt together with the offering. They would put salt on the offering, on the meat, and your table is supposed to be like a mizbeach, and therefore your table is supposed to be holy. You're supposed to be eating for proper purposes to serve Hashem, and therefore you bring bread on your salt on your table and you dip it in salt. Yes.
It's also always good to have the tablecloth. No.
It's brought down on Shabbat. A special mitzvah on Shabbat to cover your table. It has two purposes when you're covering your tablecloth. You have your table on Shabbat. Number one is because it's kavod Shabbat. It's honor of Shabbat, that you're covering the table, you're doing something special in honor of Shabbat. The other reason is that the mun that fell was covered with dew on top and on the bottom. So therefore, if you have a cover on the bottom, you have a cover on top, we have a cover the challah on Shabbat. So therefore, the tablecloth will serve also as a cover underneath and a cover on top, in reminiscent and reminding of the mun. And the challah, we have a double portion of challah, which is zeichet to the mun. That's another reason why we cover the table.
That's also the reason, right?
What do you say? That's the reason why we have two breads, is because exactly one of the reasons why we have two breads, because there's a double portion that came on Friday, that came on Friday. So therefore, to remember there was a double portion made on Friday, we have a double portion at our meals. Friday night, Shabbat day, we have a double portion, two chalot. You don't have one challah, you have a double. So that's but another reason is given, by the way, Ariel, why we go ahead and we dip the challah into salt, is because the salt gives a taste. The salt is a flavor, right? Why do people add salt? I need salt in my soup. I need more salt. People need more salt because they want it to taste better, right? So you're saying a bracha, motzi lechem in aretz. You want to have you're making a bracha. So in order for the taste to make that the bracha and the taste to elevate that the bracha should taste good, the food that you said a bracha, we have salt. That's another reason. There's multiple reasons why we have salt. So I just want to say with that point that the idea of when you say a bracha on something to taste, you should taste good, right? You make good food on Shabbat. And in honor of Shabbat, it's the taste is much. You can recognize that the taste is more important than the size of an item. So yet, it's more honorable to say a blessing on something that's whole than something that's cut, but nevertheless, they're not whole, but nevertheless, but if they're standing in a ring, weighing on this side of the ring is a guy who tastes better, the food that tastes better, that's much more significant is the taste of the food than the size of the food or the wholeness of the food. And therefore, that you would say the bracha on the wheat, even though the wheat bread, the bread that's made from wheat, is a slice of wheat bread. We're not talking about Shabbat and lechem mishnah. We're not talking about Shabbat because it's a special mitzvah. You need lechem mishnah, so that would be a different issue because you don't have you need to have the whole bread. But here we're talking about, let's say during the weekdays, I have a whole roll made from barley, and I have a piece and I have a slice. I have a slice of bread from made from wheat. So this rabbi would say that everybody would say that in this case the wheat, that slice of wheat is the quality, it's better, and therefore that trumps the fact that even though the other thing might be whole. That's what the Gemara is saying over here.
So on Shabbat, have barley,
A whole barley bread.
so wheat.
I would think you would go with the whole barley because of lechem mishnah. Because Shabbat, you have the other thing you have to take into consideration. It has to be whole. So that's what I would think you should go with the whole challah roll that's made out of barley. But you have to, because if not, you're missing the whole concept of lechem mishnah. That's what I would say over there. So the Gemara says, "Aval prusa shachit." Now, divrei mevarech ala prusa shachitin upoteh es hashleima shel sorim, and that would cover the other bread that the wheat, the bracha on the wheat, on the slice of wheat bread would cover the whole roll of barley bread. And it's interesting. What's the chidush? Isn't it obvious? I make the bracha on this, on this, on the wheat bread, that it should cover the barley bread. The Gemara wants to tell you that even though this is whole, this is a piece, so you should know it still works for the other thing as well. It's good enough. It'll cover the other thing. Now, so the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says that which we said, that a piece of wheat, you're telling me that a piece of wheat better than a whole barley roll, right? You're telling me that if it's quality against wholeness, quality wins. See, he wants to say, you know what? I found that maybe I don't think that's universal. You're telling me that's universally accepted? I think it's not so. I think he says he thinks there's a machloket tanaim, an argument of early rabbis regarding this law, whether quality trumps wholeness when you're saying a bracha. Why? Where did he find such a precedent that he wants to say this? He says ketanai. We have the mitzvah of truma. In the midst of truma, you separate truma, but you have to give 2%. The Torah does not give you an amount, how much truma you have to, the Torah says you have to give from your wheat and from your wine, your oil. But the Torah did not give a size, how much you have to give truma. And it says that the average guy gives 2% to the Kohen. 2% to the Kohen is the average guy. The guy with a good eye gives 2.5%, gives 1/40th. The guy with a bad eye, the guy who's stingy, he gives 1/60th. Those are different types of people in this world. Some people are generous, and I hope everybody here is generous people. There's some people that are not so generous. So the Gemara says, but when you go in and you take off truma, you're supposed to take off the nicer ones. When you do a mitzvah, there's a mitzvah to take the nicer fruit to give to the Kohen. So now, if we're going in and taking off truma from onions, so because also the pasuk says when you take off truma, it says mikol chelbo. You take from the fatty one. Fatty represents the better one, the healthier one, the stronger one. So from there we learn out that you're supposed to give if you have an opportunity to give, better, you give the better ones. So what happened? So if a guy has onions and you have a whole onion that's small, a small whole onion, like you see in the onion, onions comes in all different sizes. So you have a small onion, and then you have a half an onion that's much larger, that's equal in size to that small half of onion. You have because this half of onion comes from a larger onion. So now I have a half an onion, which equals size to this whole small onion. That's the case, okay? So now, what's the halacha? So he says, Tormin botzel katan shalem. So it says, the first opinion says, you go ahead and you take the small whole onion. The small whole onion is the preferred. Now, I want to add one point. I want to correct myself. That the half of onion in this situation is greater than the whole, is larger in size than the whole small onion. This is the case. Get the case again. I have a piece of onion. This piece of onion is larger in size than that whole small onion. So now the question is, who's the winner? The small onion, which is whole, or the piece of onion, which is larger? The piece of onion is larger than the whole small onion. So each one has a quality that the other one doesn't have. One has size, one is larger in size, one is complete, it's whole. So who's the winner? So the Gemara says one opinion. So we have two opinions in the Mishnah. One opinion says Tarmin Batsa Katan Shalem. You do the small whole one, even though it's smaller in size, but it's whole. Avalul Chatzi Batsa Gadol, but don't take off the piece of the large onion. Rabbi Yehuda Omer no. Rabbi Yehuda says Loki, not so. Ela Chatzi Batsa Gadol. He holds it goes after size. That's the more honorable thing. You give that larger size. That's the nicer way to go. So the Gemara suggests, my love, Bahai Kamiflagi. What are they arguing on? Most probably Rabbi Yehuda that says that you go ahead and you take the larger piece, meaning he doesn't look at the wholesomeness. He says, Sava Choshuv Adif. The most important thing is what's more chashuv, like similar to the quality of an item. He looks at the size. The size is more significant than the whole, something being whole. You look at that quality of the size. He holds.
The onion is a bad example. Because once it's cut, it's all right. If it's whole, it's no problem.
What's this cut there again?
The onion.
Yes.
Stays overnight, cut. It's of no use.
Right.
But if it's whole, you can keep it as long as you can.
Right. But let's say they're gonna
whole. Small.
Okay, so we're gonna see about if it's gonna rotting or not rotting. Let's say you're gonna give it to the Kohen today, and he's gonna use it. Let's say he's gonna use it today.
Yeah.
So then he won't have that concern that you're saying, right? So the Gemara says. So the Gemara says. So maybe one opinion holds chashuv aduf. It's more important that that's the size. He says, and therefore he says you got to take off you got to go ahead and take off from the larger one, even though the larger one is not whole. And therefore, so too would be with the quality. Goes after the quality. And the other one holds and the other rabbi holds shalem adif, that it's all about which one is whole. The thing whole is more important than the quality. So that's what the Gemara. So we'll continue tomorrow with this discussion that the Gemara at this point wants to suggest that it's an earlier two different opinions from earlier rabbis on whether you would go with something that's whole.
It's not looking, so they don't have.
No, at tomorrow state.
The diamond ring. Each diamond, you take a large diamond, which is not. It's determined. Not
This is a matter of
quality. It's not about they're they're shaped up.
It applies to bread too. You have a big
You have, yeah,
one slice is missing, it's cut, and you take a small one,
but Rabbi,
you make
Right. That's gonna be when it gets if you have a small roll
Yeah.
of challah, same quality. One's a larger piece, but one is whole. Which one should you say a bracha on?
it's like Rabbi, when
Thank you, Mr. Amos, for joining.
can we use this answer with in the parasha? Some parasha sometimes Baruch say Vadaber les Moshe les Aaron and les Aaron and Moshe saying how come we
Aaron is so much, right?
because they say they're both
They're equal.
to their syllables, so they're
Because they're both complete.
they're both complete to their own level.
They achieve right. So, but now we have to figure out which one is the nicer way. You see the whole discussion. What's the nicer way to say the bracha? We have to be so concerned. Which is the one I got to say the bracha? You never say it.
Aaron is what? Oh, yeah, what's your
Mr. Amos has advice to everybody. Hold on 1 second.
After you prayed, you're going out, right? If you prayed and you went out without the class, what did you get of it? Not almost nothing. Now you're going out happy.
Gabriel.
Taken out from
Arrête.
while you are sitting here.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
Bonjour. Hi, ça va?
Did they see Mr. Amos? Did they see him?
So, you have nothing to
Hi, Gabriel. Rien, embrasse-le pour nous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amos.
Aaron, j'étais en train de t'enregistrer la vidéo, après j'ai vu que tu l'as vu en live.
I'm smart.
Hey,
Hey.
Chef, we don't hear your voice. Don't hear your holy voice. Don't hear your holy voice, Yosef.
Jeudi.
I asked Rabbi if you're still on.
On Thursday.
That's
very nice.
Bye everybody.
Michael.
Okay, guys. Have a
Okay.
good day, guys. Bye-bye.
How's France? Okay, guys.
See you later.
Shmuel. Oh, trying to shut it down. Okay, guys. See you later, man.